Yeah, what's going on? I'm gonna go ahead and jump straight into it. I'm gonna have to keep the phone kind of close to my face because, as you can see, the traffic is heavy. Well, it kind of slowed down right now, but it's also raining, and I want to make sure the audio catch my voice. No earphones, of course. It's not my stilo. But getting straight into it, as far as like this chapter, Chapter 2, they start off mentioning 3 slaves that made it across the Charleston Harbor and to Fort Monroe at the time. The exact date was May the 23rd. Benjamin Franklin Butler had been assigned to Fort Monroe at this time, but as far as the slaves, their names, the first guy, his name was not Benjamin, I'm tripping. James Townsend. Another one, his name was Frank Baker. And then the third guy, his name was Shepard Mallory. And before I really go a little further with them, because like me doing this vlog or whatnot, I did exactly what I did with the first one. I researched a lot of extra shit. You know what I'm saying? I went through massive amounts of information or whatnot. So as far as like this chapter, they start off talking about them, but then the chapter ends, what is it, like April the 6th and the 7th, during the Battle of Shiloh, which occurred in northeastern Mississippi, about 20 miles away from a place called Corinth, Mississippi, but still along the Tennessee River or whatnot. But because of the research that I did, you know, it's a lot more information outside of the chapter, but it also complements the chapter that I'm gonna include at the same time. So as far as the chapter, even though they ended there, all the research that I, went through and all the processing I did, I'm going to end this blog talking about the Battle of Fort Wagner that took place in July of 1863. Now again, as far as this chapter, the beginning of it, I'm gonna have to remix it. So instead of just starting on May the 23rd, because it's a little bit confusion as far as Benjamin Franklin Butler. You know, some other sources that I looked at outside the book, they kind of had it mixed as far as like when he first went to Fort Monroe. Like one source claimed that he made it there like, what was it? On the 17th of April. And then the next day after that is when these 3 slaves, made it across the Charleston Harbor to Fort Monroe. But as far as the chapter itself, the date that they give, and I'm gonna put my tokens in that basket because of the book that it is. I don't think Bill O'Reilly will put his name on his book if the facts is off. So I'm gonna rest my hope or my confidence in that. But still, I want to go back like in reverse, like I say, and remix the order, because all of the shit that I researched, and like I say, I'm gonna try my best to keep it in chronological order as far as in regards to the chapter itself. But again, it's a lot more information that I got to include. So I'm gonna go back to like April, right? A month before this, and I'm gonna start off April 13th. Now that ended the last chapter of this book, Chapter 1, when they was talking about Robert Anderson and another guy named Abner Doubleday, who I'm gonna bring up later on in this vlog, because I found out, like, as far as like the beginning of Theosophy itself, and I mentioned Theosophy before, but I ain't gonna get off the topic right now. As far as that religion, I guess you could say, he's like one of the earliest members, and I found that shit to be interesting, so I researched his name a little further. But like I say, I touch on that in a second. Now, as far as the Battle of Fort Sumpter, of course, like I mentioned already, that ended April 13th. The Confederates allowed them to surrender, gave them allowed them to have like a little gun salute or whatnot. But as far as like Robert Anderson, he became a hero after this. And I want to say exactly on the 20th of April, he gave like it was like a little celebration that took place in New York in Union Square Park, and it was able to pack 100,000 people in this park or whatever. But it was also intended to build morale for the war and kind of like encourage a lot of people to enlist in the army. Because if my memory serves me correctly, I think, you know, as far as like the official United States Army at the time, I think they probably had like just about 16,000 soldiers. Yeah, I thought that was police or something. I think they had about like 16,000 soldiers or whatnot. So that event that took place on the 20th was supposed to kind of like engender more numbers, you know, like a numerical increase in enlistees or whatnot. But even then, I want to go back a little further before that, because as far as like the beginning of the chapter that I mentioned, as far as like Benjamin Franklin Butler, you know, they talk about how as far as my extra research, they talk about how like after Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, Benjamin Franklin Butler, who was from Massachusetts, had traveled to Washington. And it was notable to me because when he traveled to Washington, he met in person Jefferson Davis. Now, of course, that's the guy that was elected as the head of the Confederacy at the time. But at the same time, like I also mentioned before, as far as like South Carolina, they was the first state before Louisiana to secede from the Union. They seceded December 20th, but it was a delegation around that time that had went to Washington also. This is when, of course, you know, James Buchanan was still the president at the time. And when this delegation made it to Washington, Benjamin Franklin actually met them in person. Now, as far as what he mentioned about Jefferson Davis, he was saying like, you know, he was kind of disappointed because he thought he was like I don't want to say just a patriot, but he thought he would be like a Union sympathizer. But it turned out that he was the complete opposite of that. As far as this delegation that came from South Carolina, you know, after they made their intentions known, Benjamin Franklin Butler suggested to the president at the time to have them arrested. I thought, and this is another thing that I caught too, it's kind of like besides the point, but it was still notable to me. And when they mentioned this portion, it was like he asked President James Buchanan to have them arrested, but lame duck. Actually, they referred to him as lame duck. It just made me think about my earlier Islamic blog about like the conquest of Al-Bahrain and Kisra. How I was talking about like when they was talking about the faction underneath him, the Arabic word that was used to describe this faction under him was hostage. And I'm like, damn, somebody else put their own little, they slipped their own little perspective in the mix and shit and referred to the president at the time as a lame duck. But anyway, so he rejected having them arrested or whatnot. Shortly after that, he went back to, let me see, he went back to Massachusetts around March. And the governor of Massachusetts was a guy by the name of John Andrews. And Benjamin Franklin basically informed him of the hostilities that was kind of like snowballing, letting him know like shit, a real war was really about to happen. Like this wasn't gonna be like some fad or something like that. But he also put a word in for him to, you know, get a leadership position to also fight in this war at the same time, in which he ended up getting. So like I want to say in April is when the call to arms came or whatnot, as far as like the government asking for militias for regiments and various volunteers to enlist or whatnot. And they asked for like 3 from Massachusetts to enlist initially. 2 of them definitely did, the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment and then the 8th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment. Now, as far as the latter, that's the one that Benjamin Franklin was initially placed as the head of or whatnot. Now, as far as like some, because it's a lot of shit that happened, like Louisiana, but I'm gonna hold off on that. I'm gonna try, like I said, I'm gonna try to keep it in chronological order. As far as from the lens of Benjamin Franklin, I'm gonna put it like that. Like his first assignment took place April the 20th. But before I get into that, I got to include the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, because they landed first in Maryland. As far as like Benjamin Franklin Butler, it was also in Maryland as well, but he landed in the capital of Maryland, as far as Annapolis, that city. But just starting from the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment, they landed in Baltimore. But basically, to keep the shit simple, they ended up running into a fucking wall. When they landed in Baltimore, you know, you had a lot of people that was like Confederate sympathizers at the time. So they got attacked by a whole mob of folks. And this happened on what they call Pratt Street at the time. In fact, it was referred to as the Pratt Street Riot. And shit, pretty much they ended up getting ran out of Baltimore, and they made it to Camden Station. By the time they made it to Camden Station, I think like about 34 of the soldiers was injured, about 4 killed or something like that. Yeah, about 4 persons killed, and if not missing, I think 4 or 5 of their soldiers or their men were killed, and then like 11 to 12 citizens ended up getting killed at the same time. And the people that initiated this considered it a victory at the time, and then they gave a further threat, like if any more Union soldiers attempt to come back to the city, this is exactly what would happen again. So when they made it to Camden Station, that's when they made it to Washington. Now, when they made it to Washington, this is interesting. Like the injured soldiers, they basically like you know, turned the Capitol building in Washington City to like a hospital, basically. They mentioned a lady by the name of Clara Barton, who they, you know, based on what I read, she was kind of like surprised at the fact that, you know, these military personnel really didn't have any professional medicine men, basically, you know, like professional doctors of the sort. So she used her knowledge basically to help these people out, and then she also kind of like had people eventually come from New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts. And as far as like a legacy of her, she is where the Red Cross comes from, that organization, as far as the Red Cross. Now, the very next day, on the 20th, is when Benjamin Franklin was assigned to go to Annapolis. Now, as far as like the context of this time period, Washington was considered isolated because, you know, it's interesting. It's like, okay, it wasn't 100% assurance as far as where all of these other states stood as far as their position at the time, because you got to keep in mind, I'm gonna bring the phone close. You got to keep in mind, you got what, 33 states at this time. About 11 of them overall eventually joined the Confederation. So you had about 22 states that did not. But still, as far as those that basically eventually comprised the Union collectively, you still had at least 4 states that did not get rid of slavery. You know what I'm saying? Like you had Maryland, you had Missouri, you had Delaware, and you had Kentucky. All 4 of these fucking states did not abolish slavery until 1865. I'm gonna bring it up. I'm gonna bring that up again later on when I'm talking about Lincoln or whatnot. But as far as Maryland, Maryland is north. Because you know, keeping in mind that Washington, D.C. is basically considered a DMV. It's like within Virginia at the same time. And then you got the Potomac River that separates, well, I think Washington, D.C. is east of the Potomac River. But basically, as far as like the state of Maryland, essentially, you know what I'm saying, it's separated by this Potomac River or whatnot. But Maryland is also kind of like north of Washington at the same time, you know what I'm saying, or Virginia, you could say, at the same time, kind of like northeast of it. And the Union at the time wasn't 100% sure as far as their position. Plus, because you had these Confederate sympathizers, they had cut off transportation routes to Washington. So Washington was kind of like considered in peril. And then at the same time, as far as like Jefferson Davis, who was the head of the Confederate States, this is fucking so crazy. The capital was in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia. Now, when you look at the map, Richmond, Virginia is only, making sure I ain't covering up the audio. When you look at the map, Richmond, Virginia is only like anywhere between 80 to 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. So as far as Benjamin Franklin Butler, his assignment was to kind of like not only like, I guess you could say besiege the city, but at the same time construct a railroad route to Washington, D.C. And that's exactly what he ended up doing. So let me see, April 20th, he landed there. It took him about 7 days to complete it. Now, the head of the United States Army at the time was a guy named General Winfield Scott. He pretty much congratulated Benjamin Franklin Butler for doing that. And I want to say like after the 27th, sometime in early May, around like May the 13th, is when he also was assigned to a place called Newport News, Virginia. And he landed there as well. Place called Newport News. I think it was like Newport News Point. Yeah, Newport News Point. That was the place that he was assigned at. I'm trying to keep this. It's a lot that I want to mention. And also another fort that he established within Virginia was in Hamilton. So he also established Camp Hamilton at the same time. And I want to say like around, actually May the 13th, I believe, if I'm not incorrect with the date. I want to say May the 13th, sometime around that period, is also when he got assigned to help out in Boston at the same, not Boston, but Baltimore at the same time, in which he did go there. And he was specifically ordered to establish 4 different columns and arrive there by both land and sea. But he ended up taking a train there. Now, even though he was successful as far as his mission there, he kind of got, he dealt with some criticisms from General Winfield Scott or whatever. And as far as like his assignment, it was almost kind of like put in question at the time. I want to make sure I do not. He was successful, but I think like his assignment was kind of like not his assignment, but like no, yeah. He was successful, but it kind of created a little bit of tension between him and the head of the United States Army at the time. But he still continued his missions that he was assigned to, and I want to say like probably like the next month. No, actually, yeah, that's what I'm forgetting. A little bit after that, that's when he was assigned to Fort Monroe. Now this is later on in May. Now, if I can remember the day correctly, I think it was around like, I can't remember the exact day, but definitely before, well, I guess you could say, shit, May the 22nd. May the 22nd, because those 3 slaves that I mentioned, they didn't make it there as far as the chapter's reference until the 23rd of May. So, the 23rd comes. All 3 of these slaves that I mentioned, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory. As I mentioned already before, they came across the Charleston Harbor and then they made it there or whatever, and they explained what was going on and how they escaped from the Confederacy, because they were originally assigned to build fortifications and things of that nature. So, like, I want to say probably it is mentioned that, like, within hours, I guess you could say that, for lack of a better way of putting it, basically their slave master, or the person that was, you know, responsible for them from the Confederate lines, a guy by the name of John Baytop Carey, I believe, or John Carey Baytop. You know, he met with Benjamin Franklin Butler. He asked for these slaves back, and this was this whole historical notion as far as contrabands, slaves or black persons being, or escaped slaves from the Confederacy being referred to as contrabands of war. Him and this guy had a back and forth. They was going through legalese. From Benjamin Franklin Butler's position, he was saying, like, he considered them to be contraband of war, property now belonging to them, basically. And the guy was like, you know, he tried to argue against it, and even though, you know, it was to no avail, he still, as far as Benjamin Franklin Butler, he maintained these slaves there. President Lincoln found out about this later on, and he had a difference of opinion. From his point of view, he felt like because the United States or the Union didn't really respect the sovereignty of South Carolina at the time, that they would not really be, from a literal sense, considered contraband of war. But he still kind of like allowed it to go on. And I believe like 2 days after that point, you had like 8 more black slaves that made it to Fort Monroe. And this continued throughout the war. In fact, like a year from that point, sometime around 1862, it is mentioned, like within around mid-1862, you had about 10,000 former slaves from the Confederacy, or contrabands of war. Now, a law was put in place around that time, but I get to that in a second. I'm going to keep this in chronological order or whatnot. So that occurred or whatnot. So, about 2 months after this, one of the first major battles took place, which was the Battle of the Battle of Little and Big Bethel. Now, before I go into that battle, because that happened on the 10th of July, and then the second major one after that was the Battle of Manassas, the first one. That happened on July 21st. But the Union ended up being unsuccessful because it was a lady. Now, this is where I want to pause to give a little bit more context to this. It was a lady, and this is the first time I ever heard about this lady. Even in school, I never heard about this lady. And she, even though she's a racist and she was a spy for the Confederacy, just looking at the shit objectively, I found her to be very interesting. So I continued to research her in addition. Actually, in the chapter, she was brought up in the chapter. Her name is Maria Rosetta O'Neill. Originally, she was born in Maryland. You know, her parents, of course, were slave owners, and they were rich. They ended up moving after her father died, because he got killed. And as far as his death, they mentioned he got killed by his black valet or something like that. But they didn't say exactly how, and when I tried to find out, I could not find any specifics. But he ended up being killed, and that's when her, you know, her and her sisters, that's when she moved from that point around 1830 to Washington, D.C. Now, she moved to her auntie's house. At the time, her auntie had ran like a popular, stylish boarding house or something like that. But her auntie had a lot of clout in Washington, D.C. as well, as far as like the upper higher society in Washington, D.C. And that is how Maria Rosetta O'Neill became acquainted. In fact, later on, she came, like, as far as like these prominent folk, she became really cool with senators. It was a guy named Henry Wilson. I believe he was like the senator of Massachusetts, but he was also an abolitionist. Another guy named John C. Calhoun, and even the president of the United States at the time himself, James Buchanan. Now, because she was really cool with these people at the same time, she was a racist. So when all of these things was happening leading up to the Civil War, she became what they call a Confederate sympathizer. So once war was declared or whatnot, she chose to become a spy because she was more than just well familiar with the people there. She knew about like fortifications, like she knew the whole entire layout of Washington, D.C., other plans, even though like this is during the earlier stages of the Civil War, you know, because of her political connects, she would, well, she really wouldn't have to do too much ingratiating. She already had established a relationship with these people already. So she knew a lot of things that was going on outside of Washington, D.C. Now, it was another guy named Thomas Jordan. He ended up becoming like her, like he trained her. It was like a 26 code cipher. He trained on how to use this code to pass on information, etc. And so they had like a Secret Service network thing going on, kind of. You know what I'm saying? And he was the head of it. Now, he eventually kind of, well, he eventually, I guess you could say officially defected, but they were still in contact with each other. To remember, she was remaining on the low. So he would be like her supervisor that she would pass on information to through this 26 cipher code or whatnot. She also had assistants. They mentioned another lady named Betty Duvall. The reason why I mentioned her is because as far as like that battle of Big and Little Bethel, as well as the first major battle of Manassas, the reason why the United States lost that battle is because as far as the battle with Big and Little Bethel, a day before she had sent Betty Duvall to give information to the Confederate commanders at the time as far as like what Irvin McDowell was planning. And then, let me see, what, about 7 days after that, on the 16th of July, she communicated the same type of information in regards to what the United States was planning as far as the battle with Manassas at the time. So that is the reason why the United States ended up losing those first two battles. For example, going back to the battle with Big and Little Bethel. That was a battle that Benjamin Franklin Butler was a part of. And I think like, let me see, I think Big and Little Bethel was only like 8 miles away from Newport, Virginia. I can't remember the exact location. But as far as like on the side of the Union, as far as Benjamin Franklin Butler, he wasn't really sure of the layout. They had planned on attacking at night, and there was another guy named Ebenezer Pierce. In fact, as far as like what I mentioned earlier, as far as like when Benjamin Franklin Butler first went to Massachusetts and he was trying to, you know, put in the good word for him to get a leadership position or whatnot, this guy right here, Ebenezer Pierce, he was one of the guys that the governor of Massachusetts at the time, John Andrews, was kind of like pondering to put in a position, but he eventually ended up choosing Benjamin Franklin Butler or whatnot. But still, as far as this particular first battle of Big and Little Bethel, this guy still commanded on the ground. Now, as far as on the Confederate side of the fence, their commander at the time was a guy named John B Mcgruder. Because he had this intel, he was well prepared for them. But again, what handicapped the Union soldiers was the fact that they didn't really fully know their positions at this time, because John B Mcgruder, he had his man positioned 8 miles away from Big and Little Bethel. So they was anticipating these Union soldiers attacking them this night. Again, going back to Betty Duvall. And so the whole thing basically got sabotaged. On top of that, based on what I read, you know, both sides was kind of like inexperienced, but that's one of the main reasons, aside from the intel that the Confederates was privy to. That's one of the main reasons that sabotaged the whole battle, because like during the night, no friendly fire happened, and it also friendly fire between the Union soldiers took place. which also gave away their positions or whatnot. So that turned out to be a big ass failure. Now, as far as the second battle, the major battle that happened after this is the Battle of Manassas. Now, I want to speak a little bit more on Maria Rosetta O'Neill. But before I continue with her, I'm going to go ahead and flesh out a little bit more as far as this battle with Manassas, because this is an important battle. And it's a lot of shit that I do not want to fucking forget. Now, as far as General Irvin McDowell, all right, his overall battle plan, as far as what was mentioned at the time, included more than just attacking Manassas, as far as his suggestion that he conveyed to President Lincoln at the time. You got the Mississippi River, right? Now, I'm gonna mention this a little later on. Like I said, I'm trying my best not to it's a lot of shit that I want to fucking say, but I'm keeping this shit linear as best as I can. As far as like this guy, you got the Mississippi River, right? Because the Union kind of underestimated the Confederacy at the time. They felt like I said, like I mentioned the word fat at the beginning, they felt like this was some shit that was going to be brief. Like they was going to be able to like engage in this war, but with fucking absolute brevity or some shit. You know what I'm saying? So as far as General Irvin McDowell, his plan was to like gather at least 80,000 soldiers, right? Eventually end up surrounding the headquarters of the Confederacy, which would be Richmond at the time. And as far as this Mississippi River, this is where it gets complicated, because I'm trying not to mention too much about Louisiana, because this river becomes very important in regards to the state of Louisiana as well, because of the position of Louisiana and New Orleans, the city which is south of it, which faces the Gulf of Mexico at the time. As far as General Irvin McDowell, he wanted to have at least 80,000 soldiers occupy every major port going up the Mississippi River. Because remember, you got Louisiana, as far as like to the west of the Mississippi River. You got Louisiana, you got Arkansas, you got Missouri, one of those states that still, you know, has slavery as far as their institution. You had Iowa, you had Minnesota, and then to the fucking east of the Mississippi, I thought my phone cut off. To the east of the Mississippi River, you had Wisconsin, Illinois, Tennessee, and then Mississippi. So going all the way up, right, as far as the Mississippi River, on both fucking sides, General Irvin McDowell wanted to occupy every fucking major port. And they called it like an anaconda move, but also in addition to eventually surrounding Richmond as well. Because again, like as far, I'm gonna go ahead and mention this, I can't help it. It adds to the context. As far as like Louisiana, it was considered like a major